Namo Samantabhadraya. Namo Samantabhadraya. Namo Samantabhadraya. Hello dear YouTube Sangha. In this video, I would like to discuss my thoughts on engaging as Buddhists. This subject is a bit deeper and more relevant to Buddhist practitioners. However, I think there will be some information and points made here that I think even non-Buddhists can take home with them. As I've been involved in Buddhism for over a decade, I began to notice something rather concerning to me. Many Buddhists think the right way to practice is not to engage with social issues beyond the temple or day-to-day practice. I think this is rather short-sighted and betrays a lack in understanding of deep Buddhist tenets that compel us to be concerned with everyone's well-being in very real and practical ways. Our philosophy is actually meant to be other-regarding and not just self-centered or self-interested. In the landscape of modern Buddhism, one of the most compelling movements is engaged Buddhism. We take the teachings of the Buddha beyond the personal practice of meditation and directly into the realm of social activism. We engage with the world's suffering, striving to alleviate issues like poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, and human rights abuses. This often stands in contrast to our non-engaged Buddhist peers, who may focus primarily on individual enlightenment and view such endeavors as distractions from personal spiritual development. However, engaged Buddhists assert that social engagement is not only compatible with Buddhist principles, but is a direct manifestation of core teachings, particularly the doctrine of interdependent co-arising. Let's begin with the concept of going against the grain. A central concept in engaged Buddhism is the idea of going against the grain, or challenging societal norms that perpetuate injustice and suffering. In Buddhist terms, this concept is not about rebellion, but rather a mindful and deeply considerate response to the realities of suffering and ignorance. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that everything in the universe is interconnected, and to ignore this interconnectedness by turning a blind eye to social injustice is to abet suffering in the world. The doctrine of paticcasamuppada, often translated as interdependent co-arising, underpins this view. Interdependent co-arising teaches that all phenomena arise dependent on conditions and causes. Nothing exists in isolation. The suffering of one person is connected to the suffering of others. Likewise, positive actions to alleviate suffering in one area can ripple out, creating change in other areas. Engaged Buddhists recognize this interconnectedness and actively work to reduce suffering wherever they see it. As Thich Nhat Hanh, a leading figure in engaged Buddhist movements, said, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness." This statement encapsulates the engaged Buddhist perspective. According to Thich Nhat Hanh, spiritual practice should not be an escape from the world's suffering, but rather a means of actively engaging with it. To ignore the suffering of others is to deny the reality of interdependence. Engaged Buddhists contend that the concept of interdependence goes beyond individual spiritual practice and extends to social, political, and environmental spheres. Bhikkhu Sujato, an Australian monk, offers a profound reflection on this idea in his book, A History of Mindfulness. Sujato writes, "Buddhism is not just about the individual, it is about the collective. True liberation cannot occur while injustice and suffering persists in the world." For engaged Buddhists, the practice of mindfulness and compassion does not stop at self-awareness, but extends into addressing the root causes of suffering in society. The insight into the interconnectedness of all beings forms the foundation of engaged Buddhism's call to action. If the well-being of individuals is interconnected, then working for the well-being of others becomes part of the Buddhist path. Thich Nhat Hanh has long advocated for this approach, particularly through his work during the Vietnam War. During this time, he called for peace not only in the region, but for peace in the hearts and minds of all people. In his renowned book, The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching, he emphasizes that the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice is to alleviate suffering, which includes the suffering caused by war, poverty, and inequality. We are all interrelated, he writes, and in this deep interconnection lies the basis for peace. For engaged Buddhists, the concept of interdependence is not merely theoretical. It is a call to action. When one person suffers, everyone suffers. When one person is liberated, everyone benefits. The solution, then, is not to retreat from the world, but to act in ways that alleviate suffering on a collective level. As Bhikkhu Sujato noted, the true practice of the Dharma is the practice of awakening in society, of transforming the world. This is a practical application of the Buddha's teachings, which calls for transformation both within oneself and in the world around us. Why then would a Buddhist choose to turn a blind third eye to the injustices in the world? From the perspective of engaged Buddhism, this is not only a missed opportunity for compassion, but also morally wrong. To ignore the suffering of others is to turn away from the very foundation of Buddhist teachings, which are rooted in compassion and wisdom. The Buddha's first noble truth, the truth of suffering, acknowledges that suffering is part of the human condition. However, it also teaches that suffering can be alleviated. If everything is interconnected, turning away from suffering is to ignore the reality of interdependence, and as Buddhists, we should know better. As Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, to ignore suffering is not only to ignore reality, it is to condone it. In the Buddhist worldview, such ignorance perpetuates the cycle of samsara, reinforcing suffering rather than alleviating it. Engaged Buddhists see activism not as an aside to spiritual practice, but as a vital extension of it. Bhikkhu Sujato argues that to ignore injustice and suffering in the world is to abandon the path of the Buddha. This statement makes clear that Buddhist practice is not confined to personal meditation or achieving inner peace, but must also encompass the well-being of all sentient beings. Turning a blind eye to the suffering of others, whether due to poverty, discrimination, or environmental degradation, is seen as an immoral act, one that contradicts the teachings of the Buddha. In this sense, engaged Buddhism calls for a moral responsibility to act, to confront systems of injustice, and to work for the collective liberation of all. Buddhist teachings on compassion, karuna, and loving-kindness, metta, demand that we respond to the suffering of others. To turn away from these injustices would be to ignore the very teachings of the Buddha, who emphasized that true liberation is not possible when any being is still in bondage. At the same time, we should engage in ways that are in keeping with the Noble Eightfold Path and our precepts. We should be ever mindful of our appearance, actions, and words so as not to betray our aim. So often, people who engaged in direct action allow their emotions control their actions. But this is precisely where engaged Buddhism shines. Our practice hones our wisdom, compassion, and action so that we're spiritually and mentally prepared for adverse situations. Engaged Buddhists take various forms of action to address social, political, and environmental issues. One prominent example is the Saffron Revolution in Myanmar, or Burma. In 2007, where Buddhist monks led mass protests against the military dictatorship. This movement highlighted the role of Buddhist monks in advocating for human rights and social justice. The monks' involvement was not just a political stance, but a spiritual one, reflecting their understanding of the interconnectedness of political oppression and human suffering. In this context, their activism was a direct outgrowth of their Buddhist practice, a practice that recognized the importance of addressing societal suffering. Another notable example is the work of Thich Nhat Hanh in advocating for peace and environmental sustainability. Thich Nhat Hanh has long championed the idea that mindfulness can be applied to our daily lives in ways that benefit both individuals and society as a whole. His teachings on the interbeing of all things highlight the importance of addressing environmental degradation and social inequality. His monastic communities practice sustainable living and are deeply involved in environmental activism. In his book, Interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "If we want to help the earth, we have to practice mindfulness." For him, the cultivation of mindfulness leads naturally to actions that care for the planet and promote social justice. Engaged Buddhist organizations in the United States have also been instrumental in advocating for civil rights and environmental justice. Buddhist groups have collaborated with other faith-based and secular organizations in striving for racial equality and LGBTQ+ rights. Through these actions, they exemplify the idea that Buddhist practice is inherently connected to social transformation. We are not just spiritual individuals, we are actively engaged in shaping a world based on the values of justice, peace, and equality. And more specifically to me, I have been a member of Thich Nhat Hanh's Happy Teachers Sangha and am co-founder of the Peace of Mind organization. If you're interested in my engagement, please find links in the description below. Despite the more conservative views within Buddhism, engaged Buddhism is not a deviation from traditional Buddhist teachings, but rather an extension of them. Through the lens of interdependent co-arising, we engaged Buddhists understand our actions in the world as part of a larger web of interconnectedness. By engaging in activism, we are not against the grain of Buddhism, but we are in fact fully embracing it. We recognize that true liberation is not about personal enlightenment alone, but about the collective liberation of all beings. In this way, engaged Buddhism is not only compatible with the Buddha's teachings, it is a natural outgrowth of them. Turning a blind eye to social injustice is morally unacceptable within the engaged Buddhist framework. To do so would be to abandon the core teachings of compassion and interdependence that lie at the heart of the Buddhist path. We believe the alleviation of suffering is not only a spiritual responsibility, but a moral one that requires active participation in creating a more just and compassionate world. Well, friends, if you got something out of this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and consider subscribing. If you made it this far, sadhu to you.